Hello, my name is John Cedar, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the Innovate Kidney Series webinar. On behalf of the ASN and the Kidney X Steering Committee, um, I'd like to welcome you to this series, which has been designed to help entrepreneurs pursue innovations for people with kidney disease. The steering committee has identified 3 organizations, each with different expertise. 2 groups have already shared their expertise over the last 2 weeks. Today's Innovate Kidney webinar is what is the current market? We are sure that this discussion led by Jason Browner and Mark Current from Recon Strategy will be educational and informative. Please place questions in the chat and reach out to them afterwards. The recordings of all 3 Innovate Kidney webinars will be posted on the webinar site in July.
Thank you for that kind introduction. So our webinar is titled Innovation in an Established Market, a Perspective on ESKD. There are a couple things that we'd like to do with you today. The first is just tell you a little about the firm and the 2 speakers so you know who we are. And then in terms of getting into the substance of the webinar, first want to talk about the patient population for ESKD, both from the perspective of dialysis and transplant and some implications of those patient populations. We'll then move on to a discussion on the recent innovators in the space. And again, this is focused on dialysis innovation, primarily home dialysis, as well as advances to date in xenotransplantation. And then the last piece we'd like to discuss is U.S. market dynamics, both suppliers and vendors in the space, as well as payers. And then after going through those pieces of the market landscape, want to leave the group with some final considerations on what they may want to think about as they consider their development and commercialization journeys over the coming years, as well as potential next steps. So first, a little about our firm. So Recon Strategy was a consulting firm founded a little more than a decade ago. We have offices on the East Coast in Cambridge, the West Coast in Seattle, and our newest office in New York. We are focused exclusively on strategy, but we work across healthcare. So we do a lot of work within the life sciences, but we support payers, providers, diagnostics, and digital health as well. So really a broad perspective and a broad set of support that we provide our clients across healthcare, but really purely from that strategy domain. In terms of introductions, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Mark to start off.
Thank you, Jason. So my career has been split between academia and the business world. First started with a PhD, then an MD, then I was faculty in biomedical engineering at BU before making a transition to business through the Boston Consulting Group. Within Recon, I tend to focus on life sciences, also work with providers. And whenever there's an academic component, I tend to be engaged because I have made the transition myself from the academic world to the business world, and I understand how to bridge those 2 cultures, which can be quite different. I also have experience with early stage company through the Mass Challenge Accelerator. I've been on many panels for SBIR and SF funding, and I have a real interest in ensuring that innovation that is born of academia makes a transition where it can have impact through the business world. Back to you, Jason.
So like Mark, I'm a partner at Recon Strategy. Also have a MD in terms of my background. I've split my career primarily between consulting and biotech. First at the Boston Consulting Group, where I worked in the healthcare practice there for a number of years. Was then at Biogen, which is a biotech here in Boston. Worked across R&D and corporate development in a number of different roles, all sort of with a common theme of sitting at the intersection between the business and the science. Been with Recon for the past 9 years, really partner with Mark on our life science side. That's where I spend the majority of my time, do some work on the diagnostics and digital side as well. Like Mark, support the startup community here in Boston primarily. And the last thing that I'd say, both for myself and the firm, we've worked in the renal space for the past decade, with engagements both in terms of dialysis and transplant and xenotransplant over the years. I think we're acutely aware of the significant unmet need that sits with the CKD and ESKD population. They're really, needing new innovation to help them sort of across that disease journey. And I think very excited to be part of this KidneyX process. We have some very exciting technologies with promise to advance care for patients. And so, feel very fortunate to be part of the process today. Okay, we'll now move into the substance of the talk, starting with an overview of the patient populations within ESKD. So what we're showing here is the landscape of patient flow of patients with kidney disease. And this is all based on USRDS data from their most recent annual report. What we're showing at the top is, in general, as many know, there are tens of millions of patients with kidney disease across CKD and ESKD. This includes what's currently estimated to be 12 million patients with stage 3 or 4 CKD. And then on an annual basis, what you can see at the top gray is that, roughly 140, 150,000 patients a year progress to ESKD on an annual basis. And this includes 10 to 20,000 patients that don't initiate dialysis, 125,000 patients that do start dialysis, and finally 4,000 patients that move directly to a live donor transplant. What we're showing in the middle of the slide is really what those patient flows look like in terms of annual new starts within dialysis. And you can see of the 125,000 patients, the overwhelming majority of them moved to in-center hemodialysis, 110,000. A much smaller portion, 17,000, moved to home peritoneal dialysis. And really less than 1,000 patients moved to home hemodialysis on a regular basis. So that gives you a general sense of the proportions of the market today. On average, around 24,000 patients are fortunate enough to receive a transplant and so migrate from dialysis to transplant. And overall, you can see on the right side of the slide, roughly 250,000 patients are living with a transplant today. But I think one of the key takeaways, for the prize winners to think about is just the status quo of the predominance of in-center hemodialysis and the relative proportion of patients that have received a transplant versus those in dialysis. There's clearly an unmet need for transplant and potentially a role for dialysis beyond in-center. And this data really supports that last supposition, which is really looking from a cross-country comparison standpoint, the relative distribution of in-center peritoneal dialysis and home hemodialysis. And what you can see is that in the United States, as we just went through, heavily in-center. We can see with our Nordic countries, Sweden and Norway in the middle, still mostly in-center, but a bit more peritoneal. But most importantly is, over in Asia, and here we're showing data from Hong Kong, the data is really flipped, and it's predominantly peritoneal dialysis and not in-center. And so the takeaways that I think are important to highlight here is it's not a technological question in terms of why patients are currently using in-center versus a home dialysis solution today. It's instead based on some mix of patient preference and the system structure. And so as teams in particular that are on the dialysis technology side are thinking about new innovation, thinking through how they overcome the market hurdles today beyond just the technology piece is key. And that's in general what we're highlighting here. on the left side saying, if you want to move beyond the status quo, there are system structures in place that need to be thought through. The first is many patients start dialysis unexpectedly, so are inpatient at the time of ESKD start. And there's just a traditional referral pattern of moving those patients directly to in-center. Along those lines, when you think about the role of nephrologists, they classically have had a clear medical leadership role and in-center oversight, and that's core of their practice. And so for technologies thinking about shifting to home, understanding the relationship with hospital referral flows and understanding the relationship with nephrologists are going to be key. And so questions for teams to think about there is, beyond the clinical efficacy of your technologies, will the use of your technologies ease the burden for either new starts or switching from in-center to home? And then what do you need to do on top of that to help overcome the decades of established practice in this space? The second set of considerations are really more on the patient side, where from an awareness standpoint and a patient demographic standpoint, there are reasons why in-center is preferred today. The first is, as many of you know, patients with CKD and ESKD typically have one or more comorbidities, and it's possible for those comorbidities to be managed in-center. That is an advantage of having a facility to go to. But as importantly is the lack of awareness around what home dialysis would look like. And so whether that's just pure education in terms of understanding the options, a fear of their ability to be able to do at home, with support or not. And then finally, there's just a preference for, center for some patients today. And so similarly, as teams think about their solutions and how they meet the needs of patients, it's worth thinking about beyond the technology, what else is needed. So from an education, from a training standpoint, what will be required in order to make patients aware of these options and make them consider using them? From a patient services standpoint, what is needed to provide to overcome the fear of at home and make that a seamless transition? And then overall, based on having those solutions in place, both the awareness, the training, and the technology itself, what's the size of the opportunity in home dialysis? Switching to the transplant side, we're similarly showing a landscape here of patient flow for the transplant side of this disease landscape. And starting on the left, so again, we have those 130,000 patients a year that start dialysis. 4,000 of those, as I mentioned, will move directly to transplant, as you can see in the top gray arrow. The other gray arrow shows the rest of the flow amongst those dialysis patients. 7,000 are added to a transplant wait list before they start dialysis. Another 15,000 are added to the wait list on dialysis. And then the rest don't get on the wait list, as you can see with those larger gray arrows pointing to the bottom, where around 60,000 patients are never referred for evaluation. Roughly another 30,000 patients are referred but don't go through with the full evaluation. And finally, around 15,000 patients are evaluated but are ineligible for listing. And so overall, the majority of patients are not considering transplant and fall off at some point in that process. As you can see in the blue box towards the middle right, there are roughly 75,000 patients on the transplant waitlist to date. On average, it's 4 years until time of transplant. But as you can see with the gold arrows moving downwards, not all patients will get a waitlist. Around 9,000 a year fall off and are removed from the waitlist. Another 5,000 die on waitlist. And so overall, on 85% of patients on the waitlist won't get a transplant in their lifetime. In terms of the actual transplanted patients, as you can see on the right, 4,000 directly at diagnosis, and then 24,000 a year that are currently on dialysis receive a transplant. Roughly 5,000 are live donor, 20,000 deceased donor. And so overall, you can see that the number of transplants relative to the number of patients on an annual basis that get ESKD is far smaller. We have a significant wait list today that are not fully being met. And, as importantly, if not more importantly, there's a large patient population that's not being considered for transplant today. And so this leads to a set of questions for, teams to think about on the transplant side in terms of who their patient population is. So when they think about clinical design of trials and what that patient population should be, just overall the business case and investment case for transplant technology, whether it's mechanical or xeno, they have clarity in terms of which patients they're trying to serve. And so following from the logic of the prior slide, we really segmented out the patient population into 3 groups. The first is those that are on the wait list. This is clearly a group that has been activated and is interested in transplant. And so it's less about convincing or educating about transplant, letting them know that there's an alternative with the potential value of ensuring that they get one. Maybe there's less time on dialysis, even if they would be a fortunate one to get one. Or potentially it's a bridge to a live donor down the road. And so there's a couple different specific value props for these patients that are already on the wait list. For those that were evaluated but not eligible, I think the key question there is, will new technologies make them eligible? And so the 2 specifics there are around comorbidities that commonly make them less successful candidates for transplant. With a broader supply, again, whether xeno or mechanical, are those comorbidities a consideration? Do we need to test patients with comorbidities in clinical trials to prove that? And similarly, certain patient behaviors like smoking also portend worse outcomes and so not qualified. And so again, does that data need to be demonstrated that it's effective for those patients? And then clearly, superior over dialysis in the long term. With this last group that did not pursue, one of the key questions is just what do they need to hear from an education standpoint to be, potentially interested in transplant, and what data do patients need to hear and their clinicians need to hear for them to feel convinced that a transplant is superior to dialysis and potentially activate this group that to date is not interested in transplant. We'll now move on to second section, which is a overview of recent innovators, and I'm going to pass it over to Mark for this section.
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to talk about recent innovation in home hemodialysis and also xenotransplants. So starting with the next slide, please. So clearly, home hemodialysis has been, to date, something that has been rare. And there's a good reason for that. Clearly, peritoneal dialysis has been a lot easier. And a number of companies have started to develop new products with at least approximate goal of making home hemodialysis on par in terms of the required infrastructure, the required level of training and technical expertise with peritoneal dialysis. And really that hinges on 2 things. One is the level of infrastructure that you need in the home, and number 2, the complexity of managing the process of dialysis. So Next Stage, Outset, and Quanta have all come with systems which are significantly simpler and easier to manage in a home setting than prior systems. And they've all focused on similar things: a smaller footprint, something that is mobile, that can move around, systems that don't have to rely on a heavy water infrastructure, can use the tap or can use bags of dialysate. Systems that are simple for the users, that don't require very extensive training, with simple preparation, with cycling using modular parts that are just snapped in, and an intuitive user interface. And then finally, enabling a cloud connection so that data is seamlessly stored and there is availability of 24/7 support whenever something goes off. So all these elements have been brought together to really try to improve the process of home hemodialysis, to the level that it's feasible for a larger portion of the population. Next stage was first in the space and really developed its system and is focused on home hemodialysis. And I think their success really is validated by the fact that they were bought by Fresenius, and they are a centerpiece of Fresenius' drive into the home hemodialysis space. The two others are more recent, and while their systems in some ways are similar to what Next Stage has, what's interesting about them is that their entry into the market has largely been through acute care facilities, rather than going directly in home hemodialysis. They have basically leveraged some of the features that they had developed for home hemodialysis, the mobility, the simplicity of use, to help hospitals who are taking care of dialysis patients to be able to deploy the systems flexibly with medical personnel who may not have had quite as much experience with dialysis as those that are in a dialysis center. And they've been very successful at that. And most of their business has come from acute care facilities, although they're also playing a role in the home hemodialysis. If we could go to the next slide, please. So they're clearly on the xenotransplant side. There's a couple clear leaders who are apparent to all and who have developed well-validated, at least at the preclinical level, xenotransplant pigs. But I say visible because it's not impossible that there are a number of organizations that are, especially outside of the US, that may be working on this under stealth mode. I'm not going to summarize what has happened in this space. I'm sure anyone who is cognizant of research and development in renal is well aware of this. What I will only say is that at this stage, the expectation is that potentially tomorrow, potentially next year, there's going to be an official announcement with a formal trial starting to test these organs in patients with renal failure. And for all the innovators of today, you've got to think about what is your story to your investors, to your own teams, when this trial is announced, because clearly that has potential to change the landscape of the market. And you want to sort of be ready to answer the obvious questions that will come when either Revivicor or eGenesis or maybe another party says, we're starting a 20, 30, 40 patient trial with our xenotransplant, and we'll have the results in a couple of years. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk briefly about current US market dynamics, both from the point of view of payers, providers, and device manufacturers. So on the payer side, what's special about end-stage renal disease is the oversized role that Medicare plays. When you look at incident patients who go into kidney failure and start dialysis, their insurance coverage is representative of the population they're drawn from. Some have Medicare, some have Medicaid, many have private insurance. But because of the design of the Medicare benefits, over time they convert to Medicare coverage. And so the prevalent patients are really mostly Medicare patients. And that's sort of makes it a particular population because this is a group of patients who all have government public coverage. One twist over the last few years is that it used to be that Medicare Advantage, that patients could not be on Medicare Advantage once they had end-stage renal disease, but that has changed. And so now you have a fairly sizable population of patients who have Medicare Advantage and are in this hybrid system where it's really a public government program, but it is mediated by private entities. Now, what does this mean from the point of view of innovators? It means that you've got to think about who your best partners could be among the payer group. Medicare itself, as fee-for-service, certainly been very interested over the past decades in improving the care for patients who are on dialysis, has funded many innovation programs, including, and there's government support, including what you have with KidneyX. The limitation is that these are government programs, and by nature, they live on the tempo of government activity, which can be quite slow relative to the private sector. Private insurance, especially those that are managing Medicare Advantage plans, have a very clear interest in ensuring that there is less medical complication to dialysis and finding the most efficient, most cost-effective way of delivering dialysis. And so they may be interesting partners. The drawback with respect to the overall Medicare is that this is a fragmented market. Any Medicare Advantage or any private insurance plan will have a limited slice of the patient population. And so there's potentially less of an opportunity to scale across the entire group of end-stage renal disease patients. Next slide, please. So now looking at the provider side. Main feature of the landscape is that there are two giants, DaVita and Fresenius. We're covering more than 2/3 of the dialysis centers. And so they are, in a way, an opportunity for an innovator, because clearly once you're connected to one of them, there is a very clear path to scale. On the other side, there are large corporations, and this is not particular to them, but for small innovator to partner with very large corporation has always been a challenge. What is useful for innovators is to try to get to an understanding of what the priorities of these companies are like. And if you go listen to investor calls or corporate calls from DaVita and Fresenius, their strategic priorities are fairly consistent between the two. Number one, what is top of mind for them is that they're still in recovery mode from COVID. They were very affected by COVID. A lot of end-stage kidney disease patients sadly died, and because of that, they've had to consolidate operations around a smaller number of dialysis centers. The other thing that was top of mind from COVID is labor cost increase, especially in the healthcare professional space. And so they have been struggling to recover from what has been a really challenging period for them. Looking ahead, what they're thinking about, we'd say two major directions. One is value-based care arrangements. As we all know, end-stage renal disease patients have a lot of health needs, and they are looking to be a more holistic, encompassing provider to these patients by taking responsibility not only for dialysis, but for their entire care. And given the shift to Medicare Advantage, there are quite a number of insurers who are willing to enter these arrangements because they see these two companies as more able to manage that very special patient population. And then finally, both of them are really making a push towards increasing home hemodialysis. They see this as an opportunity to improve outcomes, to decrease costs, both from a recurrent service cost, but also from a capital investment cost. Now, if we could go to the next slide. So, like for the provision of dialysis, the device landscape for dialysis is very consolidated. There are two very large players, but then also a smattering of smaller ones. From the point of view of an innovator in the device space, this is actually probably an opportunity in the sense that when you're communicating with your investors, there is a clear exit scenario where once a device is sufficiently developed and validated, you've got natural acquirers who, with the infrastructure, with the reach to deploy them at scale, and that allows investors a very natural exit, which is something they always look for when they are initiating an investment. Next slide. So now I'll leave it to Jason to go through the final considerations and next steps.
Thank you, Mark. So to wrap up, we just wanted to cover a couple things on final considerations and thoughts on next steps. So you've heard a lot on considerations for the market and current competition, and considerations for positioning your technologies in a growing market. The other thing to consider is the longitudinal element. The R&D process and commercialization process, as you all know, is long, and there are a number of questions that you need to think about. And even for companies that are early in the stage, recognizing that our prize winners at various points. But most are early, and even though some of these questions are ones that you don't have to fully tackle for a number of years, having a vision today as to where you're ultimately going can help make sure that the technical activities and the R&D activities that you take on today best position yourself for the future. So for example, for early companies, clearly early in conception, thinking about differentiation and what evidence that you need that best demonstrates likelihood of success and de-risks your program and de-risks potential investments from new investors are critical, and those questions are paramount. But in answering those questions, thinking about the future on the clinical side, for example, which patients are you targeting and what data will they need to see? And are you targeting equivalence or superiority? Having a clear view on those questions can help you identify what preclinical studies you do today that best de-risks your program as you move into that clinical phase. A little further afield is the commercialization process, which we've touched on a bit as well. Thinking about what data requirements will we put in place, both from a regulatory standpoint from FDA, as well as from a payer standpoint, whether that's Medicare or other payers, is critical as you think about what your clinical trial data generation path is going to be. And then in terms of commercialization, are you planning on launching on your own and competing? Or is partnership or acquisition the end game? And as Mark highlighted earlier, understanding what your plan is will have different implications for what milestones you want to achieve and when you want to achieve them based on what your expectations are for your commercialization path. And finally, across the board, I think always knowing what your market opportunity is, and as importantly, where you can grow the opportunity is key to making sure that you're pulling together the right set of clinical data, the right commercialization strategy to maximize the use of these great technologies that you're all developing. So where can we help? We really work across that journey that we just went through, starting from a product development standpoint and helping companies think about what that product development strategy should be. What is the competition to date? What data needs to be demonstrated to prove value of your technologies? And what role during that development process do you need from patients and providers to ensure that the products that you're developing meet their needs? Further along, as you think about commercialization and understanding where you fit in the market, understanding patient needs that can vary and the segmentation of those patients, and we provided a couple high-level perspectives on that today. And then similarly on the provider and payer side, they have different needs and expectations for bringing new dialysis solutions or novel transplant solutions to market, and understanding how those segment out are critically important to do. And we work doing both primary research and secondary research to understand markets and really drive insights so you all are best positioned to understand how to best develop your products for maximum use by patients and to be reimbursed by payers. And then from a strategy standpoint, what is that path? You saw the journey on the path from development through commercialization on the prior slide. And so what is the right plan for a given company? Is it to take solo all the way through? Should you consider partners? At what point? And we help companies think about what that path forward may be. And then finally, just about us, I think a couple things where we are different than others that are out there. The first is our model is really based on the partners, in this case, Mark and myself, driving the work. You see us today, you would see us, throughout the project. We really spend the overwhelming majority of our time supporting our clients, and doing the actual work to understand what the right strategy is for our clients. The second, as I highlighted off the top, we really work broadly across healthcare. And so even though we have deep expertise on the life science side, we draw upon our expertise in payers, in providers, that as you're thinking about these questions, we're able to provide a bit more richness and depth because we really work across the space with that focus on strategy. And finally, we work with all sorts of companies, from market leaders in the space that are large, robust companies, to startups that may be Series A funded or pre VC funded. And I just say overall, our philosophy as a company is we, like you, want to further the healthcare industry to help patients. We see startups as a key disruptor in a positive way to bring new innovations and new treatments to patients. And we carve out a good portion of our client base to ensure that we're working with these disruptors and these innovators. And so, very excited about the prospect of the technologies that you all have brought to bear in KidneyX, and excited about the possibility of continuing those discussions with you. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to our WebEx presentation, and we're happy to take any questions. Thank you.
There's a few questions that came in through the Q&A, and we'll try to take a few of those on. The first one that I saw was the best approach for new xenotransplant solutions, given the fact that there are two leading players. And there are two main mode of strategy. One is you've got a differentiated solution that would apply preferentially to a subgroup of patients, and really pursuing that subgroup of patient is going to allow you to compete with those that are further ahead. The second is sometimes being a fast follower can be very advantageous, in the sense that the leading company has to go through the development hurdles, clarify a lot of development milestones and regulatory issues. And it's a good position to be in, to be able to take advantage of these learnings, fold them into your own development in order to push the solution at lower cost and faster. The market for ESKD for renal replacement therapy is obviously very large, and given that size, it's likely that there is well more than two players who can have a significant role in this market. So we don't see being behind Revivicor and eGenesis as necessarily a major obstacle. Jason, you want to add something?
Yeah, so the one thing that I'd add on that one is, sometimes in the device space, what we see is that there's a significant first mover advantage, particularly in a situation where devices are used in complex surgeries, where reasonably the rollout starts from a focused set of centers and surgeons, and their trainees, end up learning that procedure, and then, moving into other centers when they become attendings. And in those situations, the first mover advantage can be more significant, and being, later in the game could be more problematic. The flip side would be something like drugs. I think, very often, second or third to market is advantageous along the lines that Mark is saying, where, market development has been performed by the first company. You have greater disease awareness amongst patient and physicians, and you come along with a better in class product, and are able to compete. And the situation there is, not needing to necessarily have as much hands-on experience with a given product. And, at the end of the day, those products are interchangeable. I think, the question for xenotransplantation is, will there be differences with respect to logistics and systems in terms of how organs are brought to center? Are there any differences in, perioperative or postoperative care that would be meaningful enough that these wouldn't be considered, more or less interchangeable, like two drugs in a class? Okay, so next question. So a question around for home hemodialysis, is it better to go after, new patients or switch from patients who are already in center? So I think, the answer is that that's something that needs to be determined. I'd say generally, what we recommend to answer a question like this is a mix of patient research and physician research to, understand what the preferences are there. I think for the physician side, along the lines of what we said in the talk, there are clear, historical precedents for how they're used to moving patients, from hospital into a chronic dialysis solution. And I think the question there is, are you able to overcome that and start patients off the bat? Or is it better to get patients into a sort of a stable situation at the right time moving down the road? I think that would drive new versus switch from the physician perspective. And I think similarly from the patient perspective, is there desire to avoid, being in center off the bat, or similarly, is there value in having some exposure, with staff that have a lot of familiarity with dialysis versus doing it, at home by yourself or with a loved one? So the short answer is, market research is clearly needed to be able to answer a question like that. Let's see, other questions. Existing dialysis organizations, are they a group that I should approach? Are they more than an investor? So recognizing we've got folks on the call that are on the home dialysis side, on the xenotransplant side, presuming this question is coming from someone on the home dialysis side, they're clearly an investor, clearly potentially an exit in terms of an acquisition. But I'd suggest that there's more there than just the financial piece of this. As Mark mentioned, they're broadly thinking about value-based care. And so understanding, this world that's moving increasingly towards value and how your home dialysis solution would play in from a value-based care perspective, I think they'd have a lot of insights there. And they're broadly, thinking about the care continuum from CKD through ESKD and transplant. And so, thinking holistically about how home dialysis fits into that, they have a lot of expertise, both in terms of the structures and systems that you'd need to be able to deal with, but understanding various patient segments and interests that they have in terms of the types of patients that would be interested. So I do think that there's more there as a partner than just the dollars. What else we have?
Maybe I'll take on a question that just came in about if PD is easier and then home hemo, why is there so much innovation on home hemodialysis and not PD? So that's really a question for a nephrologist, but I'll take a stab at it. I suspect that for peritoneal dialysis, you've got a fairly mature solution in place. Not clear that there is an enormous amount of incremental improvement that can occur. Clearly in hemodialysis, as it is done in center, requires a lot of infrastructure and patient education and training. There is certainly, I think, has been recognized by many that there opportunities to simplify, to make it less burdensome in terms of infrastructure. And, that's where there's potential to move the needle a lot. So that would be my answer. Again, subject to review by a nephrologist.
Okay, let me take one more question. So a question here in terms of if I'm developing an implantable artificial kidney, do I need to work with both surgeons and nephrologists to champion or adopt my technology? I'd say generally based on our experience, the answer there is yes. We had a client a year or two ago that was in the hearing space, and in some ways was a similar dynamic. If you think about a hearing solution that would require a surgeon to be able to implant, but when you think about from a diagnosis standpoint, what are the hearing solutions that patients with hearing loss have available to them? That's very commonly an interaction that is part of the relationship with the audiologist. And so you have sort of a similar situation, audiologist playing the role of working with patient to identify the solution that's best for them, whether it's an external hearing aid or something that's implantable. Surgeon, that actually does the procedure itself. And our experience with that client was you needed to have both stakeholders involved for sort of their obvious roles, convinced that a new solution is appropriate on both sides. And so our expectation, again, without doing research on this, great question, is that a similar dynamic is likely to play. We want to do another question or two?
Yeah, I'll take the one on bringing in value-based care into the equation. And certainly it's the case that a lot of organizations that are caring for end-stage kidney disease patients are turning to value-based care solutions with a view of reducing cost and improving quality. And if you partner with these organizations, it's clearly advantageous to make a value proposition that aligns with value-based care. So if there are certain metrics that are important for this organization, showing how your solution can, say, reduce the number of admissions or emergency department visits, etc., that is advantageous. On the other hand, we've worked with a lot of early stage companies who are thinking about value-based care as an opportunity to sort of capture part of the economics linked to value-based care. And our experience is that it's not that successful as a starting point. It can come later. And the reason is twofold. One is complexity. When you've got to partner with an organization that takes accountability for a set of patients, and you have to sort out which metrics and what benchmarks you have to meet in order to get a share of either the savings or the bonus on quality, that becomes very complex and complicated and is an obstacle in getting started. The other thing is clearly attribution. So, say for instance, there's a medical transportation company that's going to help patients get to their appointments so they have less ED visits. Figuring out whether they were responsible for a change in ED visits versus a different approach by the primary care physician versus other things is very difficult. And again, that becomes complexity that makes it harder to get anything started. So value-based care, important to have in mind, important to have that as part of the value proposition to larger organizations that you might partner with, but probably not the greatest solution, the greatest approach to try to be compensated based on impact on the value-based care metrics themselves at the beginning, at least.
All right, so maybe last question, just given the time. A question here for our artificial kidney developers. Does FDA want to know the type of immunosuppressant? Would that be part of the clinical trial evaluation? I don't think there's a clear yes or no on this one. I think this is clearly a discussion point to be had. With FDA, I'd say, a corollary situation would be there are other drugs that have been evaluated in the transplant space, and those clinical trials were done in the context of background protocols for how centers treat their transplant patients. And so the presumption with a clinical trial design like that is sort of an all-comers approach to the type of immunosuppressants that have been used. There are clearly questions to be discussed with the agency on both the uniformity of a set of immunosuppressant regimens that are used by medical teams that could reliably serve as a representative sample for what's out there. I think the other question is the degree of novelty with the device. Questions around, foreign body rejection, fibrosis, could that potentially change by immunosuppressant? Depending on what data have been seen in a preclinical package or maybe in early clinical studies, may help inform, both the sponsor and the agency's view on the appropriateness of having one uniform immunosuppressive regimen across the full trial versus allowing sort of each center to choose their preferred approach. Ultimately, that's a discussion that needs to happen with the agency. Commonly sponsors would make an argument, and that would be a point of discussion with the agency to get to conclusion before running a pivotal trial. Okay, I think given the time, maybe we'll stop there with questions. Apologies to those that we didn't get, but you have our email, so feel free to reach out if you have a burning question that you'd like some perspective on. Otherwise, we very much appreciate your participation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason and Mark.